Okay. We're here today with the Los Angeles District Attorney, George Gascon, who I've come to learn has a sort of long career in both law and in the legal end of law. At one point in 1998, I believe it is,
1998.
he was actually the captain of Harbor Division and rose through the ranks relatively quickly and became a sort of deputy
assistant chief. Well, deputy, but then assistant chief. Yeah.
Assistant chief of the city of Los Angeles, and was a contender for the chief of police, but did not get that, and then went to Mesa, Arizona, and then went to San Francisco, and then was appointed by Governor Newsom, then Mayor Newsom, to be the district attorney of San Francisco.
Yeah.
And he's now back in Los Angeles and has an interesting story to tell about law, order, and justice. So here we are, and welcome, George.
Thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. So what I'm curious about is normally the vast majority of the people that I know that are in law enforcement are pretty hard-nosed law enforcement people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the law is the law. You know, sometimes they let things slide, but for the most part, you know, cuff them, throw them in jail, and the district attorneys or city attorneys tend to be pretty much the same way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, their job is to prosecute criminals. What I'm curious about is at what point in your career did your thoughts about criminal justice and reform evolve to the point where you realize that the kind of hard-nosed, throw them in jail attitude just wasn't working, and that there had to be reforms?
Yeah, and I continue to believe that a big component of the work of the district attorney and the police, police to make arrests sometimes, and the district attorneys to prosecute. So I don't dispute that is a central function of the work. But for me and my own personal evolution, as after spending over 30 years in policing, including 27 here in the city of LA, and then 3 years in Mesa and about a year and a half as chief of police, 3 years in Mesa as chief of police, a year and a half in San Francisco, and then having been the assistant chief of police here for running operations for a few years as well, is that the way that we enforce the law, right, and the way that we apply the authority that is given to us by the people, right, needs to be measured and needs to be thoughtfully applied in a way that is going to actually not only have an immediate solution to the problem you're facing, but just as importantly, what you don't want to do is you don't want to cause more harm downstream. So what do I mean by that? We know, for instance, that jails and prisons are not necessarily a place where people get better, right? We know that we have to incarcerate people sometimes because they need to be held accountable, and sometimes they're dangerous, right? And we need to remove them from our community for a period of time. But the data and the science that is available today, that wasn't available 30 or 40 years ago, really speaks very clearly to how in the American system, by the way, and I'm going to underline that because hopefully we can get into what other places do it differently and more effectively. But in our system, the reality is that incarceration generally doesn't necessarily cure a problem. And sometimes it actually makes it worse, other than the sort of the removal from society for a period of time.
Right. But you see, you came along after the President Nixon's war on drugs. And that sort of set into play this kind of zero tolerance, particularly with
Right.
the drug laws. And then later under Reagan, and then some under Bill Clinton, for these rather strict interpretations. I mean, before in California, we had actually voted to outlaw the death penalty.
Yeah, and it's interestingly that you raise this, because actually it really isn't until the 80s that our sentencing schemes start to increase, and then by the 90s it's like it's unbridled, right?
Right.
We became prison happy, right? But if you look at actually, all the way through the late 70s in California, for instance, prison sentencing was very consistent with Western Europe, right? As a matter of fact, I work often with an attorney whose father went to prison in the early 70s for manslaughter, right? And he did 6 years in prison, and then was released and eventually became a PhD on a professor at UCLA, and he actually retired from UCLA as a professor. And this lawyer says, if my father would have been arrested for the same thing today, he would never have the opportunities he had. So, and I think that's a perfect example of how do we, the current system actually throws people away, and rather than giving them an opportunity to rehabilitate and come back and be actually a taxpayer and a successful member of our society, we foreclose those doors, right?
So that brings us to the issue of what, particular initiatives that you have run for office on, and the particular issues that you champion today that are getting you challenged from your deputy district attorney.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, because I also like to look at history, and most people are not aware of this, but when Steve Cooley ran for the first cycle of re-election, he had 8 people from the office run against him. Right. So I think there's something in the water in the office that many people feel that they want to challenge their boss, which is totally fine. That's what democracy is about, right? You have every 4 years or every 2 years, if you're in Congress, you run for office. So, but I think that what we see today, which is probably a little different, is that I think that we see a period of time in our nation where not only do we have this political polarization that is really splitting people apart, but we increasingly are living in a world where we make alternative facts, right, very quickly, and we adopt them. And then there are people actually, and through social media and some of the developments that have occurred in journalism, probably in the last 10 years, but more so in the last 6 or 7, you have the stories that take a life of their own, and pretty soon you have a segment of our population that deeply believes in stories and in events that maybe never occurred the way they're being presented, and that creates
right. So inside of your office, you have gotten a certain amount of pushback, even from certain deputy DAs who support your positions, but think that you move too fast. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, and look, I think that actually it's kind of interesting, because I know that you wrote an article in my first 100 days, I think, and I know that you spoke to people that were former members of the office that are now members of the bench, and I was kind of, and I read it then, and I read it, as I was coming over, and it was interesting how. So much of the predictions that came from that person actually have turned out to be false, right? The prediction was that, for instance, if we stop prosecuting juveniles as adults, gangs were going to use juveniles to go and shoot people up. And I'm not saying that that never happens. Listen, I supervised a gang unit in South LA, but that is not generally what happens every day, right? And kids don't go around shooting people because they're being told by the adult, go shoot them because there's not going to be any consequences for you. And so I was kind of, just sort of smiling internally, because it is true that when I came into office, we're in the middle of the pandemic and crime was going up everywhere in the country, certainly in our county. Interestingly enough, proportionally, our crime was not going up as highly as neighboring counties that have the prosecutors that think like that judicial officer obviously does. But now we have this precipitous drop in homicides and violence. Actually, we're getting back to the pre-pandemic years. We're still doing business the same way. We have been doing business this way since I became in office over 2 years now. And you have to wonder if my policies would have caused the increase in crime, then you would think the crime will continue to go up. But it's not, right? And it's not because the work of the prosecutor is not necessarily to deal with, it's not going to impact large patterns, macro areas of crime. It does hold people accountable for their individual behavior, and it provides safety in certain instances. But we don't cause crimes to go up or down. There are many other social and economic factors that are at play.
Name two of the socioeconomic factors that law enforcement can't deal with.
Yeah.
But actually are cause for either property crime or violent crime.
Well, look, first of all, there is the levels of income inequality, right, that we are experiencing today, which there's no, certainly in modern U.S. history, that has not been the case. A lot of people don't understand, for instance, we have more public housing in 1981 than we do today. And I'm not talking about per capita, I'm talking about raw numbers. So if you actually understand that we're a larger nation in terms of population, we actually have less public housing now that we do. Exactly. You actually begin to get a grasp of, why our houselessness or homelessness problem is so acute today and so unprecedented. When you look at the problems that we've had, that, we created really bad public policy around mental health about 40 years ago, right? There were good reasons to shut down some of those very inhumane large institutions that we had. But the idea was always to turn around and reinvest that in community-based treatment. Which never happened, right? So we now have a large segment of our population that is suffering from severe mental health problems, and they don't have housing. And then, we have an epidemic with drug use. So you start combining all this income inequality, racial tensions and inequalities, poor education, and a healthcare system that is completely dysfunctional, especially for poor and so all the things that start building up, and you cannot. I don't care how many cops and how many prosecutors you have, you're not going to cure any of this stuff through a criminal justice system, right?
The epiphany that I had during the Rodney King uprising was that there was they estimated some 35,000 Angelenos were rioting in the streets. And I looked at that and I said, well, that's less than...
it's a very small number.
Less than 1%. And I said, at any given time, if less than 1% of the people can bring the entire city to a standstill, and there are not enough police officers, then policing is not about enforcement. It is about the other, 99% of the people obeying the law the majority of the time.
100%. I'll give you a really interesting point. Crime now in most of the major metropolitan areas of this country is going down. Interestingly enough, in some of the more conservative jurisdictions, it's still going up, right? At the same time, we're having a crisis in finding enough young people that want to be police officers for a variety of reasons. By the way, I think that sometimes people say, well, it's because the profession is being maligned and people don't want to get into that. And I think certainly there's a component of that. But I think also the reality is that, the younger generations are looking for different kinds of employment opportunities. Policing requires young people to come in with sort of a plan to be in the profession for decades, right? And that was a model that when I came in, right? You came in, you figure you're going to do 20, 30 years. And young people today do not think in those terms, right? Because we've sort of taken away that mentality that you have one job or two jobs for life, right? Primarily because economically people get terminated very quickly, companies.
But the government professions are one of the few in which you can spend your entire career at one job.
You do, but the problem is that you have a generation of young people that is being groomed through their own educational process, going to colleges and universities and high school, thinking this is not what life is going to look like for you. And then you have this friction that, you're going to come into a place where actually you're expected and frankly required. The investment that a police department makes in hiring and training someone requires that they be around for a good decade or two or three, right? Because,
But it also has to do with the inside cultural aspects within a department, like your department or LAPD or the sheriff's department. And most of those departments are not necessarily the kind of cultures that reflect the attitudes of younger people getting out of college. Okay, so let's move on to something else here.
Yep.
You started a conviction integrity unit and has been involved in 2 high-profile cases of actually innocent prisoners being released after decades behind bars. Maurice Hastings, who spent 38 years in prison, and Daniel Saldana at 33 years. In your mind, why is that important? Because I actually think that sort of relates to what we just talked about.
It's critically important, right? In going back to, kind of in a way, sort of the intersection that you talked about earlier, about the reality is that safety is about people, the willing compliance, right? And the other point that I didn't get to finish earlier, I'm just going to bring it up for a second, is that, crime is going down in spite of the fact that arguably police departments are smaller. Prosecution officers are smaller because we're having a hard time recruiting, right? I mean, you take the LAPD, if you hear the chief and the mayor say, well, they're down 1,000 people, right? So you would think, well, if there's a direct correlation between the number of officers and crime, then crime should be going up, but it's not, it's going down, right? Which goes to the point that we depend on a compliant, willing community for safety.
And believes that justice is fair and equitable.
100%. So going now to the issue of conviction review, and if you want to follow the same path here, part of believing that justice is fair and equitable is believing that when people get prosecuted and incarcerated, that was a just outcome. And when you have an innocent person that gets basically railroaded and put in prison for years, in this case decades, it takes away from that credibility that is so critical for those that are governed to believe in government, and in this case, the criminal legal system. So it's very important for me that we actually correct those mistakes, or sometimes maybe not so much mistakes. I mean, I think when you look at some of the evidence, you look at best case scenario, you look at negligence, worst case scenario, you may look at intentional racially based biases, right? Mr. Hastings, well into his sentence, almost 2 decades into prison, he continually asked our office to have his DNA tested. And Mr. Hastings actually always maintained that he was innocent, which I understand. It's not unusual. A lot of people in prison say they're innocent and they're not. But in his case, he actually even refused, the parole system, they require you to admit responsibility and sort of show regret.
Right.
But because he knew that he didn't do it, he refused. So he continued to be in prison and not be paroled. But twice he asked the officers before I became the DA to test his DNA. He was told that the DNA had been destroyed. When I became the district attorney and the request came up, actually I was told by someone that is no longer in the office, very high-ranking person, and this person said to me, well, we have to protect the integrity of the conviction at all costs. And I questioned, I said, well, does integrity have to do anything with integrity in terms of how the process worked, or you meaning keeping the outcome
The same.
the same, right?
To protect the
Yeah.
prosecutors, not.
Yeah, exactly.
Not the,
So obviously I disagree. I directed that we find the DNA. We found the DNA. We tested it, and not only approved that Mr. Hastings was not the murderer and rapist, but just as importantly, it pointed to who did, and who did actually went out and committed another rape after Mr. Hastings had been prosecuted.
a similar thing had happened with the Saldana case,
Absolutely,
right?
yep.
In which the DA's office actually had held on to, what would you call it?
Exculpatory information.
Information.
Right. Yeah.
And didn't release it until you showed up.
Yeah. Yep. So, again, this is the kind of stuff that, the philosophy of almost win at all costs, right? Which is so deeply embedded.
That's kind of in our culture, isn't
It
it?
is. It is. Yeah, it's very embedded in our culture.
Nobody wants to take responsibility for screwing up, and making a mistake.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks, it justifies in their own mind that they're right.
Well, yeah, sometimes they do. Yeah, a lot. Many times they do. Yeah.
So, moving on here, your office has an alternative sentencing court program. It was set up before you took office. And how does that help law enforcement? And how have you been able to make it actually more effective?
Yeah, so, I mean, again, if you go back to public acceptance of the work, it's actually, police officers have a safer working environment when the people that they are policing believe that they're there to serve that community, right? One of the situations that creates some of the greatest danger for police officers when people believe that the officers are not there to protect them, they're there to harm them. And I know this, right? I was a young sergeant during the insurrection.
Right.
I worked in South LA. I know exactly the tensions that were there, which made it incredibly unsafe for everybody, including cops, right? In fact, there are studies that show that actually police departments that use less force actually are safer for the officers. The officers, and the way that we measure that actually is by workers' comp claims.
Right.
You have a significant reduction in, for those that may not understand what I'm talking about, injuries on duty are measured by your workers' comp claim. Police departments that have very strict use of force policies actually have less workers' comp claims, which means that officers are not getting harmed, right? So having that acceptance and that different relationship with their community, not only does it create safer communities, it creates safety for police officers.
So connect that to one of your initiatives back when you were a police officer about community-based policing.
Yeah.
So that term gets thrown around a lot.
It is, and and unfortunately, it's misused a great deal. But conceptually, what it really meant was creating partnerships between law enforcement and all the different stakeholders in the community to decide and to really evaluate what is important to that community within the framework of the law and safety, and create basically focus and attention on those things where the community actually believes that they're best served. And having almost like a co-governing approach to policing. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's sort of been, being implemented in most cases, right? And it's one of the things that has become extremely relative. It means very different things to different people.
Right. The whatever community-based policing model in the sheriff's department is significantly different than LAPD.
Absolutely, and even within
most smaller cities probably don't even have a program of some.
Yeah, and even within the LAPD, right? I mean, the LAPD, because the city is so large, right? The way that a community is policed. Look, the way San Pedro, I don't know today, right? But I'm going to tell you when I was a captain, the way San Pedro was policed was somewhat different than Wilmington, right? And Harbor City, Harbor Gateway. And the way that we police in Watts was very different. And when you really think about it, that shouldn't be the case. It doesn't mean that you should not reflect the values of your community, but, regardless of what community, regardless of your socioeconomic, regardless about your race, you should feel that the police is there for you, not.
The difference with Harbor Division is that for the longest period of time, the captain of Harbor Division thought of himself as the chief of the San Pedro Police Department.
Well, yeah.
And for many of those years, the police officers that worked at Harbor Division lived in San Pedro.
That's correct.
Okay? And so, to a certain extent, there was this bias because they knew that they were enforcing the law on their own people, and they felt that, connectivity.
Right.
And did so in what might be considered not an unbiased way.
Right. And I mean,
I've read it.
Yeah, and to a great extent, frankly, that is why you have seen with very minimal success, but pushed by many cities to ensure that police officers live in the same community that they work. Right.
You can't enforce that.
Well, you cannot. It's being deemed unconstitutional to begin with. But the attempt is precisely because I think that, to the point that you're making, and I don't think most young officers can afford to live in San Pedro anymore. But certainly years ago they did, and many were born and raised in San Pedro, right? And I think that they were working with their neighbors. They when they run people on the street, maybe they went to high school with and all that stuff. So you do develop a different approach to the work. And I would say that by and large, that's a good thing. I mean, occasionally you get a little bit of some insidious, a little bit of corruption, right? But I think if you were to put it in the scale, the benefits of having police officers that actually understand the community deeply and have roots in the community is generally a good thing.
Your alternative sentencing court program. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, again, if you go back to what I said at the beginning, I said that, I definitely believe that we need to prosecute cases, and, some people need to be incarcerated because they're dangerous or they need to be held accountable. But the question becomes, does that apply to everybody, number one, that we come in contact with? And number two, even if you have to incarcerate someone, are the levels of incarceration should be, the maximum punish that you can get, or should it be just enough to ensure that you correct the behavior or you abate the danger to the community? And what the alternatives to sentencing planning is rather evaluating every case on their own and assessing what is the best intervention for this case, and really looking at it both through a social and as well as an economic point of view. If you understand how expensive it is to incarcerate people,
right,
and where that money is taken away from education and public health and so many other things, you begin to understand that you should be very thoughtful about your approach to this. In fact, I was talking to a group of people yesterday, but I often tell this. Years ago, I was invited to go talk to a group in Texas, and they were called Right on Crime. And I don't know if you ever heard of Right on Crime. There was a very conservative Republican group that was actually advocating reductions of prison sentence. And they were doing it primarily because of the economic costs of prisons. Mm-hmm. And so I'm talking to this group, and which is mostly Republican, very conservative, folks in Texas. And I was invited by the Chamber of Commerce to go talk to them, interestingly enough. And as I was going through this, I mentioned to the group, I said, look, the reality is that reduction in incarceration, there is a highway with multiple lanes. it's a highway with multiple lanes, and it doesn't matter what lane you take. Since I have chosen to take the social justice lane because I think it's the right thing to do, but for some it may be just purely economics, right? You know, putting somebody in prison costs a lot of money, and you should be
And that's a very conservative value, right?
very conservative value. Yeah, so you should be very measured.
Our most conservative governors in the state of California have all been about building prisons.
Right.
And the most conservative politicians we've had would have never considered the cash bail system as being inequitable.
You're correct.
So, how did you get from being a one-time Republican to a political Democrat that believes in the zero bail?
Well, I mean, this gets very nuanced, right? Let me begin first of all by educating our viewers and how the bail system works, and then I'm going to tell you what I believe, because there are two different things, right? So the way the bail works is the court sets the bail. So in California, you have 58 counties, and every year the Superior Court for that county sets what is called the bail schedule. And basically, it's a very mechanical process. You look at the penal code, you look at the offense, you look at the conditions of the event, and then they said, okay, if you did this under this set of circumstances, this is going to be your bail, right? And then when you get arrested, the officers book you at a jail. The person in the jail looks at your offense, and they look at the bail schedule, and boom, that's your bail, right? The problem with that is that it often, fails to understand the impact of cash bail, right? And what
the millionaire can pay
a dangerous
$1,000 bail on a crime, and the poor person can't.
A dangerous person gets out, and I've seen that. In fact, we had here during the pandemic, we had individuals arrested 4 times for armed robbery. Collectively, he posted almost $500,000, equivalent to a $5 million bail collectively. And then on the 5th time he got out and he committed murder during a robbery, right? This is a person that after the second robbery, we were arguing he should be held without bail because he's dangerous, right? So there's no connection between how much money you have in the bank or how much access you have to money and whether you're dangerous or not. On the other hand, we know that people that cannot afford the bail often languish in custody, and they lose their employment, and usually these are people that are right on the border, economic borderline, so they become homeless. Well, if they get acquitted,
paid the price.
Well, absolutely, and usually they get released immediately for time served. Or I'll give you another one, which is even more egregious. Is you will have sometimes a very poor person, but you have maybe grandmother will take a second trust deed on the home to bail them, only to find out 3 or 4 days later that the prosecutor is not going to move forward with the case, but they actually lost that money.
Right.
So I mean, there are a lot of inequities here, but to the point is that bail is not controlled, but it's controlled by the courts, right? Whether it's in LA or anywhere else. And in fact, the LA Superior Court just recently came up with a whole new bail scheme starting in October, where basically they're saying that for non-serious, non-violent crimes, there will be, bail would not be required. There would be different interventions. It could be ankle monitoring, it could be probation.
And you support this?
I support it 100%.
And does the rank and file police officers?
Well, I think it's mixed, right? Because I think it really, you have police officers that are still very stuck on the old days, and you have some that are, that are really understanding the concept of the value of this. But let me go back to this because I want to underline this. Bail system is controlled by the courts. What I believe is actually irrelevant as to how the system works, which is something that I have been blamed so much for. When we went through the emergency cash bail during the pandemic, right. People were getting released. I was being blamed for it. Well, I believe we did the right thing, but that's not what the controlling issue is. Just like now the courts are going in this direction. By the way, part of the reason why the courts are going into this is really twofold. Number one, a Superior Court judge in LA County ruled that cash bail was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has kind of come along those ways in the Humphrey versus San Francisco case,
Right.
the California Supreme Court. So the court is actually recognizing that if you're dangerous, you should be held regardless of how much money you have.
Right.
And if you're not, you should be released.
Yeah. With opponents in the office and inside of your office and wealthy ones outside, were you surprised when they attempted a recall with you?
No, the only thing that surprised me is how quickly they did it, right? I mean, literally the day that I was sworn in, I was told the following day that some people went to the county register trying to file for a recall.
Right.
And they actually had to be told that by rules they had to wait 90 days. And 90 days in 1 hour,
Yeah.
they filed the first time and they spent about $2 million. That failed. Then they filed the second time and spent over $8 million, and that failed again.
What does that tell
Now
you?
they're trying.
Not just as a DA, but as a politician.
Well, first of all, I understand that, technically I am a politician, but my motivations are not necessarily the politics. My motivation is really the safety and the work in our community. And I understand that the vehicle to get there is to be elected, so I get that. What people often fail to see, the reason why those two, recall attempts fail is because the majority of the voters didn't agree with it, right? People also forget that I was elected by a large majority, over 250,000 people voted for me as opposed to my opponent. In some places that's an entire district, right? You got Congress people that get elected by a fraction of that, right? So the reality is that while there is definitely detractors there, the reality is that I had a very clear platform. Number one, everything that I said that I was going to do, I did. I was elected precisely in the things that I said I was going to do. And the support for these policies continue. And
you still feel that kind of support is in the community? I mean, even with everything that has sort of gone on and the incessant crime reporting on television all the time, the statistics go down on most of the crimes, and the reporting and the car chases and everything else goes up.
Yep.
And therein is the difference between perception and reality.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, I think that.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, I deal with that by having a very strong commitment to being a public servant, right? Mm-hmm. So number one, I make myself available, and I spend a lot of time going through our community, both in places where people agree with me and places where people disagree with me. Number two, I continue to find a tremendous amount of support for the work that I do. Now, generally, a lot of the people that support this work are not the people that are in, some of the very conservative, sort of right-wing media. They're not the people that are screaming in one of the social media platforms. But those are the people that put me in office, right? And obviously, the ultimate test of all this is when election time comes up.
The only poll that matters.
Right? The only poll that matters is that one. And, I'll continue to do the work. And if the public continues to support me, I will be reelected. And if they think that there should be a different way, then it is.
Have you done any polling, or do you have any sort of internal sense that the policies that you've implemented are actually still as popular today as they were when you first ran?
Well, I do for multiple reasons. Number one, and I use internal differently, but I'm going to use internal the way, for instance, there has been opposition internally in my office against the policies, but we see increasingly young people applying to come to work in our office that are coming because of these policies, right? They want to come and work here. And we're getting young prosecutors from very conservative counties around us, Orange County, San Diego, San Bernardino, Riverside, applying to come to work, and we're hiring some of them.
Because you think that they, or do you actually ask them?
No, I meet every one of them I actually, I interview every single person that gets hired because I want to get into their
You
heads.
personally do?
I do. Everyone that we hire, I actually interview, and people will tell you what you want to hear, and I get that. But I've been around long enough that I can use proxies to understand where people are coming from. And by and large, these young people that are coming in, number one, they're coming in because they like what we're doing and they want to be here. They understand the historical significance of what we're doing.
Getting on to like investigating officer-involved shootings, I would imagine that is both with the police department and the sheriff's department. What's the incident cases on that dating back to say 2012?
Well, one of the biggest complaints that I got, and I got it really by many areas of our community, was the perception that when police officers were committing crimes, they're not being held accountable to the same standards as everybody else. And I think that there were some cases involving videotaping where force was used that the DA's office walked away from and that were very shocking. I mean, in fact, there was a case where the chief of police of the LAPD, Charlie Beck, actually asked my predecessor to prosecute the shooting of an unarmed man. And there was evidence that the officer not only used excessive force, but that he lied because there were video that he was not aware of it at the time. And the office walked away from it. And I think that, it's those incidents that actually harm.
And then there's all of that stuff that happened over in the city of Torrance with the racist stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was pleasantly shocked that your office went into it to investigate that.
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to this whole area. Look, first of all, let me be very clear because I think sometimes people misunderstand me. I am deeply passionate about police work. Okay, I spent most of my adult life in a blue uniform, and I believe in good policing. But for me, good policing is with capital letters, right? And I think that part of good policing is ensuring that when there is problems that you address them, because actually when there is a bad incident, that actually makes it bad for all the good officers that are trying to do the work every day. Right. And I experienced that, right? I was a young officer during the insurrection. I was paying the price for what happened to Rodney King.
You're not the only former LAPD officer that has told me that very same thing, that it was the Rodney King uprising that fundamentally changed their perspective, and it set the trajectory for the next, 30 years of incremental, gradual change in LAPD, which at this point has still not been perfected.
Right.
But
it's much better than it was then.
And I think we have much better leadership. My argument would be it's the culture of inside of LAPD and the kind of officers that it usually attracts, which you're remedying by having these new policies that is attracting younger people that actually are trying to sign up. That's pretty good stuff.
Yeah, look, a lot of people, first of all, let me say this. Look, most of the people that come into policing come in with a clean heart.
Yeah.
They really want to serve the community. And then, for a variety of reasons, things in some cases, and really it's the exception, right?
It's the 1%.
The exception, right, exactly. It's the 1%, things go south and they impact everybody else. I was at a community meeting earlier this week, and a community member was almost surprised. She said there was a woman that was clearly mentally ill. She was walking around the intersection naked, and the officers came in, and she says they were so kind, and they offered her a blanket, and they offered her water, and then they, sometime later, a crisis intervention team came up, And she basically mentioned that as that was somewhat unique. And I said, look, that's not unique. That's what cops do
Right.
most of the time, right?
Right.
You just happen to see this, right? So I think that we need to start from the place that we understand that most cops come in with a pure heart to do the right things. And then you have small percentage that for a variety of reasons, something happens and goes wrong, and it makes it bad for everybody. But if you don't hold that individual accountable, then the credibility and the currency of the policing goes down.
Is the same true inside of the prosecutor's office?
100%. Look, I mean, most people that come in to do this job, again, you know, whether you come in as a prosecutor, you come in because you have a strong sense of public service.
Great. George, we got to wrap up. I truly appreciate you coming in to visit with us today and to share your point of view. And you are up for re-election in 2024.
That's correct, yeah.
And I'm sure there will be others on the ballot running against you.
There will be a few.
And I think it'll be an interesting poll of whether or not the regressive ideas that you have brought forward in terms of law enforcement and justice actually get the majority vote. And I think that will make a huge difference in the way in which Los Angeles County sees itself.
I agree, and obviously, at the end of the day, it's up to the public, right? And I understand that, and I'm very humble when it comes to understanding where I fit. Yeah. I'm going to fight really hard to get reelected, but the public makes a final decision.
Great. Well, George, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap for us. Again, James Allen with George
Gascon.
George Gascon.
Yeah, not Buscaino. That's another. That was the other cop.
Yes.
It used to work for me.
I could tell you some stories about that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Anyway, Random Links News. Here you go.